I've been a wildlife photographer for over a decade, and I've camped in some of the most isolated places in the country. The deep forests of Utah were nothing new to me. Rugged, quiet, untouched. It was late September when I set out on a solo trip to capture some rare wildlife shots, hoping to catch glimpses of elusive mountain lions or maybe even a black bear. The plan was simple: hike deep into the woods, set up camp, and stay for a few days to maximize my chances. I packed light but smart: camera gear, rations, a tent, and a fire starter. I'd done this dozens of times before. Nothing about this trip seemed different. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line, I had already been hiking for hours. The forest stretched endlessly around me, dense with towering pines that muffled every sound. I picked a clearing near a small creek and set up my tent. I felt good, calm, focused. As the fire crackled, I flipped through some of the photos I'd taken earlier. A hawk perched on a dead branch, a fox darting between the trees. The kind of shots that made trips like this worth it. The silence was comforting, almost meditative. Eventually, I zipped up my tent and drifted into sleep, lulled by the distant hoots of an owl. Sometime in the early morning, a sound woke me up. Not a snap of a twig or the rustling of leaves, just an absence of noise, like the entire forest had gone still. I listened, barely breathing. Then a faint shuffle. Close. Too close. My hand moved toward the flashlight, but before I could reach for it, everything went quiet again. I stayed frozen for a while, ears straining for any movement. When nothing followed, I forced myself to relax, convinced it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. I had been alone in the wilderness enough times to know the mind could conjure all sorts of things in the dark. At dawn, I crawled out of my tent, stretching off the stiffness of the cold night. But something was wrong. My backpack was gone. My supplies, disturbed. Items I knew I had zipped up were now scattered across the dirt. My first thought was a raccoon or maybe a curious coyote. But then I saw them. Footprints. Dozens of them circling my tent. And they weren't from an animal. They were human. Barefoot. The footprints weren't just scattered. They followed a deliberate path, looping around my tent multiple times. Some of them were deeper than others, like whoever made them had stood in place for long stretches of time. My stomach tightened as I traced the tracks with my eyes. They led toward the tree line, disappearing into the undergrowth. I didn't see any other signs of a person. No discarded trash, no remnants of a fire, no boot prints. Just those bare feet, pressed deep into the dirt. My first instinct was to call out, but my throat went dry before I could even form the words. I forced myself to think rationally. Maybe another camper had wandered into my sight. Maybe they were lost, confused, or just messing with me. But why wouldn't they say anything? And why the hell were they barefoot in the middle of the woods? The morning light gave me a false sense of security, so I followed the tracks for a bit, camera in hand, just in case I spotted something worth documenting. I moved carefully, stepping over fallen branches and damp leaves. The forest smelled of pine and wet earth, thick and still. Every few steps I'd stop and listen. Nothing. Just the occasional gust of wind shaking the branches overhead. Then I saw it. My backpack, propped up against a tree about 50 yards from my camp. The straps were undone, the contents spilled out like someone had rummaged through it. My stomach knotted as I stepped closer, scanning my surroundings. I picked up my bag, checking inside. My food was gone. My extra flashlight was missing. But the strangest thing? My camera was still there, untouched. Whoever had been here wasn't interested in my gear, just my survival supplies. That was when the fear really settled in. I spun around and started back toward my tent, my breath quickening. My plan had changed. I wasn't staying another night. I was packing up and getting the hell out of there. But as I approached my camp, I noticed something that sent a jolt of pure terror through me. The footprints, those same barefoot prints, I had assumed they were just circling my tent, but they weren't. Some of them weren't moving at all. They were standing still, facing my tent, facing me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse hammering in my ears. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever had been out here wasn't just passing through. They had been watching me, standing there, motionless, for God knows how long. My skin prickled as I scanned the tree line, my eyes darting between the trunks, the thick undergrowth, anywhere a person could be hiding. The morning light suddenly felt weaker, like it wasn't enough to push back the shadows between the trees. I had never felt this kind of fear before. Not the kind that makes you scream or run, but the kind that keeps you frozen in place, every instinct screaming that something is deeply, horribly wrong. I forced myself to move, to act. I shoved my camera into my bag, tore down my tent in record time, and stuffed everything into my pack without caring if it fit properly. Every few seconds I glanced up, expecting to see someone emerging from the trees, a face peering from behind a trunk. But there was nothing, just that crushing, suffocating silence. My hands shook as I slung my pack over my shoulders. The only thought in my mind was getting out. I didn't even care about the trail. I just wanted distance between me and this place. I hiked faster than I ever had before, my boots crunching over twigs and dead leaves. Every now and then, I thought I heard something behind me. A faint rustle, a shift in the trees. But I didn't dare look back. I pushed forward, breath ragged, legs burning, refusing to stop. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, parked miles away at the edge of the forest. I threw my pack into the back seat, locked the doors, and sat there gripping the wheel, heart pounding so hard it hurt. I half expected to see someone step out from the trees, barefoot and staring, but the woods were empty. I never went back to that part of Utah. I don't even like looking at the photos I took that trip. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those footprints, how they weren't moving, how they were just standing there, watching me sleep. And I wonder, if I had woken up just a little earlier, if I had unzipped my tent at the wrong moment, would I have seen them? Would they have still been standing there? Or would they have been closer? I took the job because I needed the money. It was late October and work had been slow. A land developer had hired me to survey a large wooded property in northern Connecticut, miles from any main road. They were looking to clear it for future development, but first they needed to assess the terrain. I was supposed to spend a full day hiking the land, marking points, and making notes. I didn't mind. I'd done similar jobs before, and I liked being alone in the woods. But something about this place felt different the moment I stepped out of my truck. The trees were thick, gnarled, and overgrown, and the silence was almost unnatural. No birds, no wind, just the dull crunch of dead leaves under my boots. A few hours in, I started noticing the wire. Thin, rusted strands stretched low between trees, just high enough to catch a boot if you weren't paying attention. They were crude, but deliberate. Some were set in loops, others in spirals, hidden under leaves and branches. I figured they were old hunting traps, illegal, sure, but not unheard of. Maybe some poacher had used this area years ago. Still, they unsettled me. I took out my phone to snap a picture, but I had no signal, and my GPS was already acting up. I marked the spot on my map and kept moving. As I went deeper, I found more signs that I wasn't the first person here. A pile of bones, small ones, probably from rabbits or squirrels, sat near a blackened fire pit. Rusted tin cans were scattered nearby, their tops jaggedly peeled back. And then there was the tent, or what was left of it. It had collapsed inward, its fabric torn and faded from years of exposure. But the strangest thing was the food. A small metal pot sat on a rock next to the fire pit, filled with something that looked fresh. The smell of boiled meat and herbs clung to the air, and the coals beneath it were faintly warm. Someone had been here. Recently. I turned to leave. I wasn't scared yet, just uneasy. Maybe some hermit or hunter still used this place from time to time. Either way, it wasn't my business. But as I retraced my steps, something caught my ear. A soft, metallic snap just behind me. I spun around. One of the wire snares I'd stepped over minutes ago had been reset. The loop, which had been loose before, was now taut, waiting for something, or someone, to step into it. My stomach clenched. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to stay calm, but my pulse was hammering in my ears. Maybe it was the wind, I told myself. Maybe a branch had fallen and disturbed the snare. But deep down I didn't believe that. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, the undergrowth, the spaces between the trunks. Nothing. Just the same eerie stillness that had been pressing down on me all day. I took a breath, adjusted my pack, and kept moving, faster this time. I wasn't panicking, not yet, but I was done sightseeing. A few minutes later I heard it again. A sharp, deliberate snap off to my left. This time I didn't turn around. I just walked faster, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck. Whoever was out here, they were playing with me, resetting the traps, letting me know they were close. I gritted my teeth and focused on my map, trying to find the fastest way back to my truck. But the deeper I went, the more the landscape stopped making sense. Trees I swore I'd passed earlier looked unfamiliar. The terrain seemed to shift, subtle but wrong, like I was walking in circles without realizing it. Then I saw the cabin. It was barely visible through the trees, just a dark shape crouched low against the earth. I hadn't seen it on my way in, and it wasn't marked on my map. It was small, more of a hunting shack than a proper cabin. The walls were warped, the roof sagging under years of neglect. But there was something off about it. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. And nailed to the front, just beside the entrance, was a row of bones. Long, thin ones strung together like wind chimes. I couldn't tell if they were from animals or something else. That was enough for me. I turned around and walked as fast as I could without running. I wasn't about to stick around to find out who lived there. My truck was a few miles away, but I didn't care. I'd hike the whole damn way without stopping if I had to. But before I even made it 100 yards, I heard something that stopped me cold. Footsteps, not mine. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Not the scattered rustling of an animal, not the aimless shuffle of wind in the leaves. Someone was following me. I swallowed hard and kept moving, resisting the urge to break into a sprint. Running blind through the woods was a good way to end up tangled in one of those damn snares, or worse. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to listen. Whoever they weren't trying to hide. They wanted me to hear them. Then, just as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. I paused, heart pounding, straining to hear anything over the blood rushing in my ears. Silence. But not normal silence. It was wrong, hollow, like the entire forest was holding its breath. And then, right behind me, so close I could feel it, a voice. Low, rasping, almost playful. "You shouldn't be here." I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I just ran. Branches tore at my jacket. Roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't stop. I could hear movement behind me, fast and steady, keeping pace. I was being chased. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I pushed forward until I saw it. My truck. I fumbled for my keys, practically throwing myself inside, slamming the door just as something heavy thumped against the back of the truck. I didn't stop to see what it was. I turned the key, gunned the engine, and tore out of there so fast I nearly skidded off the road. I never went back. I told my employer the land was inaccessible, that the terrain was too unstable for development. I didn't mention the traps. or the cabin, or the voice. But I still think about it. About the footsteps, the snare tightening behind me, the whisper in my ear. And the worst part? Sometimes, when I'm outside at night, alone in my backyard, I swear I hear it again. That same quiet, rasping voice. You shouldn't be here. I was never the type to believe in ghost stories. Sure, I like them, the way people do when they're swapping spooky tales around a fire, but I always figured there was some kind of rational explanation behind everything. That changed on a cold October night 2 years ago. It was me, my best friend Alex, and his girlfriend Sarah driving back from a weekend trip. We'd spent the past few days at his uncle's cabin, fishing, drinking, and just getting away from the noise of the city. The drive home was long, and we'd taken a more isolated route to avoid the highway traffic. The only things around were trees, the occasional road sign, and the dark expanse of the reservoir to our right. We were halfway through this empty stretch of road when Sarah spotted him first. A lone figure walking along the shoulder, his clothes dark and clinging to him, like he'd just crawled out of the water. Alex slowed down, and I felt my stomach twist. Everything about the guy seemed wrong. The way he held himself, stiff and uneasy. The way his head turned slightly when he noticed us, but never fully faced us. Sarah, ever the kind-hearted one, said we should stop. "It's freezing out there," she reasoned. "He looks like he needs help." I wanted to argue, to say that picking up strangers in the middle of nowhere was how horror movies started, but Alex was already pulling over. The man hesitated before getting in. Up close, he looked even worse. His skin was pale, like he'd been drained of all warmth, and his eyes had this vacant, far-away look. He muttered something under his breath before climbing into the back seat. The moment the door shut, a damp, musty smell filled the car. I could feel the cold radiating off him. "Where you headed?" Alex asked, trying to sound casual. The man didn't answer right away. He just stared out the window, his fingers gripping his knees. Then, in a hoarse voice, he said, "I have to go back." "Oh, Dieu!" A shiver ran down my spine. "Back where?" I asked, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. He didn't look at me, just kept staring out at the reservoir. "It's still down there," he whispered. "It's waiting." Sarah turned to face him, her voice gentle. "What's down there?" He didn't answer. Instead, he let out a shaky breath and wiped at his face, though his hands came away dry. My stomach churned. Something wasn't right. The guy looked soaked, smelled like he'd been dragged through the mud, but his hands were completely dry. None of us spoke for a while after that. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional splash of water against the rocks by the reservoir. I kept glancing at the guy in the mirror, half expecting him to do something, shift, fidget, anything, but he barely moved. His breathing was slow, deliberate, like he was concentrating on something just outside the car. Then, suddenly, he spoke again. "I shouldn't have left." His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence, it felt deafening. "I was supposed to stay." Alex exchanged a glance with me, his knuckles tightening around the wheel. "Stay where?" he asked cautiously. The man's eyes flickered toward him, hollow and unreadable. "Down there," he murmured. "It doesn't like when you leave." My skin prickled. The way he said it, like he wasn't talking about a place, but something alive. "Who doesn't like it?" I pushed, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. He just turned, slowly this time, to look at me. And for the first time, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. His clothes were damp, sure, but the seat beneath him was bone dry. I felt the air go thick in my lungs. I wanted to say something to Alex, to Sarah, but my throat had closed up. The guy's stare lingered a second longer before he turned back to the window. The gas station was just up ahead, a lone beacon of light in the darkness. "We'll stop here for a minute," Alex muttered. "Get some coffee. Maybe call someone." He didn't say who we'd call, but I knew what he meant. Something about this wasn't normal. Sarah nodded, her face pale, and I forced myself to breathe as Alex pulled into the lot. The second we came to a stop, I turned around. The back seat was empty. For a few seconds, none of us moved. I just stared at the seat where he had been, completely dry, like no one had ever been there. My brain struggled to catch up. I turned back to Alex and Sarah, expecting them to say something, to react, but they were just as frozen as I was. Did he get out?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but that didn't make sense. We hadn't heard the door open. We hadn't felt the car shift. There was no way he could have just slipped out without one of us noticing. Alex threw open his door and stepped outside, scanning the lot. There were only a couple of parked cars by the pumps, their drivers inside the gas station. No sign of him anywhere. I climbed out, my legs feeling unsteady, and looked around. The road stretched back into darkness. No footprints, no wet marks on the pavement. Nothing. "There's no way," I muttered. My own voice sounded distant, like I wasn't fully in my body. He was just here. Sarah stepped out next, rubbing her arms. "Maybe?" She trailed off, shaking her head. There was no logical explanation. We stood there for what felt like forever before Alex finally let out a nervous laugh. "Okay," he said, rubbing a hand down his face. "Let's just get inside. Maybe there's security footage or something." But when we went in and asked the clerk if he'd seen anyone come in, he just frowned. "No one's been in or out for the last half hour," he said. "Just you guys." That was when I felt it. That cold, creeping feeling, like someone was still watching us. I turned toward the glass doors, half expecting to see him standing there. But there was nothing. Just the empty night. We never talked about it again after that. Not really. Every now and then, Sarah brings it up, half joking, like she's trying to convince herself it didn't happen. But I know what I saw, or rather, what I didn't see. And sometimes, when I'm driving down an empty road at night, I catch myself checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see a pair of hollow eyes staring back at me, waiting. I was never the kind of guy who believed in supernatural stories or conspiracy theories. I like to think I had a solid grip on reality. But that weekend in the mountains with my son, Ethan, changed everything. It was late October, the air crisp with the bite of early winter, and we'd driven up into the Appalachians for a weekend of hunting. Just the two of us, like we used to before life got too busy. Ethan had just turned 17, and I figured it was one of my last chances to spend real time with him before he went off to college. We left early Saturday morning, parked the truck near an old service road, and hiked for miles into the deep woods, where the trees grew thick and the ground was covered in a blanket of dead leaves. It must have been sometime in the afternoon when we strayed off the usual trail. I'd been tracking a set of deer prints, and Ethan was a few steps behind me, quiet but alert. He wasn't a kid anymore, but I still felt the need to watch over him out here. I don't know how long we walked before we noticed the trees thinning out ahead, opening into a clearing. That's when we saw it, half buried in the earth, like the ground itself had tried to swallow it. A concrete bunker, the kind you'd expect to see in an old war movie. It had no markings, no signs, just a rusted metal door set into the gray wall, and a narrow vent at the top, clogged with dead leaves and dirt. At first, we just stood there, staring. "What the hell is this?" Ethan muttered, shifting his rifle on his shoulder. I didn't have an answer. It didn't make sense. There were no records of military bases or old fallout shelters in this part of the mountains. And yet, here it was. Curiosity got the better of us, The door wasn't locked, just slightly ajar. And when I pushed it open, the heavy metal groaned like it hadn't been moved in years. The air that rushed out smelled stale, like damp earth and rust. Inside, the bunker was small, barely the size of a single room, lit only by the faint daylight seeping through the cracked ceiling vent. We stepped inside cautiously, our boots crunching over dirt and debris. That's when we saw the signs of life: scattered food wrappers, an old thermos, a pack of cigarettes on the floor. A couple of sleeping bags, rumpled and unzipped, lay against the far wall. Personal belongings were strewn around: a worn-out baseball cap, a plastic flashlight, a few pages ripped from a notebook. But no people. No sign of who had been living here, or how long ago. Ethan bent down and picked up a can of beans, turning it over in his hands. "Dad, this isn't old," he said quietly. He was right. The expiration date was recent. Someone had been here. Maybe still was. A strange feeling settled over me, like we had walked into something we weren't supposed to see. I took a step back toward the door, suddenly aware of how deep we were in the woods, how far from the truck, from the main road. "We should go," I said, keeping my voice steady. But Ethan hesitated. "What if someone's hurt? Or hiding?" His eyes darted around the room, scanning the corners. I wanted to tell him this wasn't our problem, that we had no business being here. But before I could, we both heard it. A noise from outside. It was faint at first, just the crunch of leaves, the rustling of branches. But it was getting closer. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. I put a hand on Ethan's shoulder and motioned for him to stay quiet. My heart pounded against my ribs. The bunker suddenly felt too small, too exposed. I turned back to the doorway, ready to slip out quietly before whoever was out there saw us, but then, right in front of my eyes, the heavy metal door began to move. It wasn't a sudden slam. It was worse than that. The door groaned on its hinges, inching inward with agonizing slowness, like someone was deliberately pushing it shut. I lunged forward, trying to grab it, but before my fingers even touched the metal, it clanged shut with a deep, echoing finality. The sound bounced off the concrete walls, making my ears ring. I grabbed the handle and yanked. It didn't budge. Locked, from the outside. Ethan let out a shaky breath behind me. "Dad!" His voice was barely a whisper, and I didn't need to see his face to know he was scared. I was too, but I couldn't let him know that. "It's fine," I said, trying to sound calm. "It's probably just—" I didn't even know how to finish that sentence. A prank? A mistake? A gust of wind? No, none of that made sense. Whoever had been living here had locked us in, and now we had no way of knowing if they were still out there. Or worse, if they were already inside. I pressed my ear against the cold metal door, straining to hear anything outside. Silence. No footsteps. No voices. Nothing. My pulse was hammering in my ears, and for a moment I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But Ethan's wide-eyed stare told me otherwise. I turned back to the room, scanning it for another way out. There was only one possibility: the vent near the ceiling. It was narrow, but if we could break the rusted grate off, maybe Ethan could squeeze through. I moved quickly, dragging an old wooden crate under the vent to stand on. "Help me up," I said, and Ethan did, his hands shaking as he boosted me. The metal was corroded, flaking under my fingers. I braced myself and yanked hard. Nothing. Another pull, and it groaned, but held. "Come on, damn it," I muttered, putting all my strength into it. Then I heard it, a sound from behind us, a quiet shuffle, like fabric against concrete. My stomach dropped. I turned my head slowly, barely breathing. The bunker had been empty a minute ago, but now I wasn't so sure. Ethan was frozen, his eyes locked on something behind me. "Dad," he whispered. His voice was so thin it barely reached me. I climbed down, my boots hitting the floor with a dull thud. The air inside the bunker suddenly felt thick, suffocating. My brain scrambled for logic, an explanation. Maybe we were just scaring ourselves. Maybe the sound had come from outside, an echo. But then something moved in the farthest, darkest corner of the room. A shape, barely distinguishable in the dim light. It was low to the ground, shifting ever so slightly. My breath caught in my throat. It hadn't been there before, and yet somehow it had been here all along. I didn't move. Neither did Ethan. We just stood there, our eyes locked on that dark corner, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. Or maybe what we weren't seeing. The shape was wrong. Too low to be a person crouching, too still to be an animal. And yet, it had shifted. I was sure of it. My instincts were screaming at me to get out, but there was nowhere to go. The door was locked. The vent was still intact. We were trapped. Ethan took an unsteady step back, bumping into a metal shelf. The sudden noise made my heart slam against my ribs, but the shape didn't react. It just remained there, like it was watching. "Who's there?" I finally forced out, my voice rough. No response, no movement, just the heavy, suffocating silence pressing in around us. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers clumsy from adrenaline. The beam wobbled as I lifted it, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. And then, the light hit it. I don't know how to describe what I saw in a way that makes sense. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It was wrong. Twisted. The shape looked like a bundle of limbs curled in on itself, tangled in a way that defied logic. The skin, if it even was skin, was pale, almost gray, stretched too tight over bones that jutted at unnatural angles. And then, the worst part, it moved again. A slow, jerking motion, like a puppet with its strings being pulled by an unseen hand. Ethan made a sound, a strangled, breathless noise, before clamping a hand over his mouth. My body had gone stiff, every muscle locked in place, but my mind was screaming at me to move, to do something. Then, the thing in the corner twitched again. This time, it was deliberate, purposeful. One of its arms, or what I think was an arm, unfolded, the joints bending the wrong way, fingers stretching out like they were testing the air. My chest tightened. We had to get out. Now. I grabbed Ethan's sleeve and pulled him back toward the door. "Help me push it," I hissed, shoving my shoulder against the heavy metal. It didn't budge. I tried again, harder, my palms slick with sweat against the cold steel. Nothing. Ethan turned, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "Dad!" But before he could say anything else, the sound of metal scraping against concrete made us both freeze. The thing was moving. Slowly, painfully, it began to drag itself forward, its limbs bending and twisting as it crawled across the floor. I could hear it breathing, ragged, uneven gasps, like its lungs were filled with liquid. The flashlight beam wavered in my shaking hand, casting erratic shadows that made the thing look even more unnatural. My stomach churned. I didn't want to know what it looked like up close. Ethan snapped out of his paralysis first. He turned and ran toward the crate under the vent, scrambling up onto it. "We have to get out through here," he yelled. He reached for the rusted grate and yanked hard. It groaned, the metal protesting, but it was starting to give. I turned to follow him, but a sound from behind me made my blood run cold. A deep, guttural, clicking noise. And then, for the first time, the thing spoke. The voice wasn't right. It was layered, distorted, like multiple people speaking at once but slightly out of sync. "You shouldn't be here." The words dragged, stretched unnaturally like it was struggling to form them. I felt a deep, primal terror settle in my bones. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. It had never been human. Ethan gave one final pull, and the vent grate snapped free, clattering to the floor. He didn't hesitate. He hoisted himself up and started crawling through the tight space. "Come on," he shouted, his voice barely masking his panic. I turned back toward the thing which had now pulled itself halfway across the bunker. It was closer. Too close. Its face, if it even had one, was still obscured by the shadows, but I could see its fingers clawing at the floor, hear the wet sound of its breath. I jumped onto the crate and shoved myself into the vent, my shoulders scraping against the rusted metal. My heartbeat was so loud it drowned out everything else. Ethan was already ahead, pushing forward as fast as he could. I wriggled through, feeling the tight walls press against me. Then, just as my legs disappeared inside, I felt something grab my boot. A jolt of sheer panic shot through me and I kicked as hard as I could, connecting with something solid. A sharp, inhuman shriek filled the vent, vibrating through the metal. Then the grip loosened, and I scrambled forward, nearly crashing into Ethan as we reached the other side. We tumbled out into the open air, gasping. The bunker's roof was partially caved in, letting us escape onto a mound of overgrown dirt and debris. Without a second thought, we ran. Branches whipped against my face, my lungs burned, but I didn't stop. Neither did Ethan. We didn't speak, didn't look back. We just ran until we saw the faint outline of my truck through the trees. Only then did we collapse, our chests heaving, unable to process what had just happened. We never spoke about it after that. Not really, not in detail. I don't think either of us wanted to relive it. But sometimes, late at night, I hear things. That same faint clicking noise just outside my window. And I know, deep in my gut, that whatever was in that bunker, it's still out there, and it remembers us. I've always preferred hiking alone. It's not that I don't enjoy company, but there's something about the solitude, the steady rhythm of my boots crunching against the dirt, the distant calls of birds, the wind filtering through the trees. It's the kind of peace that's hard to find anywhere else. Last October, I took a weekend trip to Black Ridge National Park, a place I'd never visited before. The trails weren't too crowded, and the forecast promised crisp autumn air and clear skies. I packed light, a tent, some food, my trusty pocket knife, and my phone to document the trip. I liked taking pictures, not for social media, just for myself. Little snapshots of quiet moments, the way the sun hit the trees, the way the fog clung to the valley in the mornings. The first day was perfect. I followed a winding trail that cut through dense pines and led to a rocky overlook. I stopped often to take photos, trying to capture the way the golden leaves caught the light. By late afternoon, I found a good clearing to set up camp near a creek. As I unpacked my gear, I realized I hadn't seen another person all day, not since leaving the trailhead that morning. It was unusual, but not unheard of in off-season months. That night I sat by my small fire, flipping through the pictures on my phone. They were beautiful, exactly what I'd hoped for. The landscape looked untouched, pristine. I turned in early, lulled to sleep by the distant hoot of an owl and the rustling of unseen critters in the underbrush. The second day, I hiked deeper into the park, taking a less traveled path that led past an old fire watch tower. It was abandoned, its wooden steps weathered and sagging, but I climbed up halfway just for the view. More photos, distant hills, a stretch of dark forest, the sky streaked with wispy clouds. It was late afternoon when I started making my way back, retracing my steps toward the creek. That's when I started feeling off. Not scared exactly, just aware, like something had shifted. The woods felt different, too quiet, as if they were holding their breath. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, but there was nothing behind me. Just trees and shadows stretching long in the fading light. That night, the feeling lingered. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that spending too much time alone in the woods could mess with anyone's head. But as I sat by the fire, I caught myself listening, really listening, to the sounds around me. The wind moving through the branches, the distant gurgle of the creek. But there was something else too, a faint snap of twigs, a shift in the leaves. I held my breath. The noise stopped. I shone my flashlight toward the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. Just the dense wall of pines. Still, I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I drifted off, I'd jolt awake, convinced I'd heard something moving just beyond my tent. I woke up feeling groggy, my neck stiff from tossing and turning all night. The morning air was cold, and a thin layer of frost had settled on the grass around my tent. I figured I was just paranoid from spending too much time alone. I needed to shake it off. As I made coffee over my small camp stove, I scrolled through the photos I'd taken the day before, hoping to distract myself. That's when I noticed something strange. In one of the shots from the fire tower, a figure stood at the edge of the frame, barely visible through the trees. I frowned, zooming in. It was blurry, too far away to make out any details. Probably just another hiker, I told myself, but I could have sworn I hadn't seen anyone all day. Curious, I kept scrolling. The next few pictures were fine. Landscapes, trees, close-ups of mushrooms growing along the trail. But then, in another photo, there he was again. Same distant figure, standing in the woods. And then again, in the next. My stomach clenched. The realization hit me all at once. The photos were in chronological order, and in each one where he appeared, he was closer. Not dramatically, just a few steps forward each time. A shape in the distance, then a silhouette among the trees, then a figure half hidden behind a thick trunk. But the worst part? The final picture. I had taken it right before heading back to camp. In it, the man stood clear as day at the edge of the trail, maybe 20 feet away. Still blurry, but closer than ever. I tried to think rationally. Maybe I had just missed him while hiking. Maybe he was another camper, coincidentally taking the same route. But that didn't explain the way he was positioned in every shot. Never walking, never moving. Just standing, watching. I felt an icy wave of fear crawl up my spine. My gut told me something was wrong. I didn't remember seeing him. Not once. I shoved my phone into my pocket and quickly packed up camp, my hands shaking as I stuffed my sleeping bag into my pack. I needed to get out of there. The hike back to the parking lot was the longest of my life. Every rustling leaf, every snapped twig sent my heart hammering. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see him standing somewhere in the trees, but I never did. Still, the feeling of being watched never left me. The sun had barely risen when I finally reached my car. I threw my pack in the back seat, locked the doors, and sped out of there without looking back. The moment I hit the highway, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't check my phone again until I got home that evening. I had convinced myself that I had overreacted, that I had let my imagination get the best of me. But as I sat on my couch, exhausted and finally feeling safe, I pulled up the photos again. My stomach dropped. There was something I hadn't noticed before. In the very last picture, the one where the man was closest, his face was just clear enough to make out some details. No defining features, no eyes, no mouth. Just a pale, distorted blur where a face should have been, like a smudge on a wet canvas. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just some random hiker. I didn't know what the hell I had captured, but it wasn't normal. I spent the next hour staring at the photos, trying to make sense of them. I even tried running the images through a few filters, hoping they'd sharpen the figure, make him seem more human. But the more I looked, the worse it got. In some shots, his limbs seemed too long, his stance slightly unnatural. And no matter how much I racked my brain, I couldn't remember taking a single picture, where I had seen him with my own eyes. It was like he was only there when I wasn't looking. I considered posting the photos online, asking if anyone else had seen something like this, but the idea made my skin crawl. What if acknowledging him somehow made it worse? That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that last photo. The figure standing too close, that strange, warped face. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. But then, at 3:12 a.m., my phone buzzed on my nightstand. A notification. My heart pounded as I reached for it. It was my photo app. New memory created. Your weekend at Black Ridge. My hands went cold. I hadn't made any albums. Slowly, I opened it. The app had automatically compiled a slideshow of my trip, complete with soft, cheerful music. The first few images were normal, sunlit trees, winding trails. But then, right in the middle, was a picture I knew I hadn't taken. It was a shot of my tent, taken from the tree line. And in the foreground, facing the camera, was the man. Closer than ever. I always loved hiking. Ever since my son Evan was little, I made it a tradition to take him out into the woods every summer. Just the two of us, no phones, no distractions. Just father and son, getting away from the noise of everyday life. This time, we picked a spot deep in the Appalachian wilderness, far from any main trails. Evan was 16 now, taller than me by an inch, and though he acted like he'd rather be anywhere else, I knew he still enjoyed these trips. We set up camp by a small clearing close to a stream, and as the sun dipped behind the trees, we got a fire going. It was peaceful, until Evan suddenly stopped talking and went stiff. "What's wrong?" I asked, following his gaze into the trees. His face had gone pale, eyes locked onto something just beyond the firelight. I turned to look, but all I saw were trees stretching into the darkness. "What is it?" I pressed, but Evan just swallowed hard and muttered, "Nothing. Thought I saw someone." He forced a laugh, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. A weird tension hung in the air for a few moments before he shook it off. "Never mind, let's eat." I nodded, though a prickle of unease settled in my gut. The woods were vast, but we were miles from the nearest town. Who the hell would be out here? We tried to enjoy the rest of the night. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the trees, and we talked about old camping trips, about how Evan used to be scared of every little noise in the woods. He rolled his eyes, playing it cool, but I could tell he wasn't completely relaxed. Eventually, we put out the fire and crawled into the tent. I was exhausted and fell asleep almost instantly. But at some point, deep in the night, I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me. It was the feeling that something was wrong. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps crunching in the leaves outside our tent. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, my pulse pounding in my ears. Evan was still asleep beside me, his breathing steady. I glanced at the faint glow of embers outside, and that's when I saw him. A figure, barely illuminated by the dying fire, sitting on the log where Evan had been earlier. Motionless. Watching our tent. For a few seconds I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe a shadow, a trick of the dying firelight. But then he moved. Just the slightest shift, his head tilting, like he knew I was watching. My breath caught in my throat. He was too still, too quiet. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight, but a deep, primal part of me screamed not to. I didn't want him to know I was awake. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the knife I kept in my backpack. My fingers found the handle, gripping it tight as I forced myself to stay perfectly still. Minutes passed. Maybe longer. I lost all sense of time. The fire burned lower and lower until it was nothing but a faint glow. And still, the figure sat there, just watching. My muscles ached from holding still, but I didn't dare move. Then, out of nowhere, a soft rustling in the trees broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. The figure's head snapped toward the noise. For the first time, he moved more than an inch. He turned his body slightly, listening. And then, without a sound, he stood up. He moved strangely, like he was trying not to be seen, even though he had been sitting in plain sight for who knows how long. He took a few steps back, disappearing into the tree line, his form melting into the darkness. I stayed frozen, gripping the knife so hard my hand ached. I wanted to believe he was gone, but something told me he was still there, just out of sight, watching. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every time I heard the wind shift or a twig snap, my pulse jumped, convinced he was creeping closer. At some point I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the tent fabric. Evan stirred beside me, yawning. "Man, I slept like a rock," he muttered. I sat up slowly, every muscle stiff. My mind was racing. Should I tell him? Would he even believe me? But when I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, all my doubts vanished. The fire pit, which we had carefully put out the night before, was covered in fresh ashes. Like someone had restarted it. Like someone had been sitting there for hours after we fell asleep. My stomach twisted. The sight of that fresh ash sent a deep, sickening certainty through me. He had been here long after I last saw him, watching, sitting right where Evan had been earlier, like he was taking his place. I scanned the tree line, my skin crawling. Everything looked normal in the daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I turned to Evan, forcing my voice to stay steady. "We're packing up, now." He frowned. "What? We just got here." But something in my expression must have told him not to argue. He sighed but started rolling up his sleeping bag. I kept my knife in my hand the whole time. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the leaves made my pulse hammer. I expected to see him again, standing just beyond the trees, waiting. But there was nothing. By the time we had everything packed, the sun was high, filtering through the trees in warm golden streaks. It should have felt safe, but it didn't. The feeling of being watched never went away. The hike back was silent. Evan kept looking at me like he wanted to ask what was wrong, but I didn't trust myself to speak. When we finally reached the car, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I threw our gear in the trunk, got in, and locked the doors. Evan was still giving me that confused, slightly irritated look. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" he finally asked. I hesitated. I didn't want to scare him, but I also couldn't pretend nothing had happened. "Last night," I said slowly, gripping the wheel, "there was a man sitting by our fire, watching the tent." Evan frowned, shaking his head. "Dad, that's not funny. I'm not joking." My voice was flat. "And that fire? We put it out. But when I woke up, someone had been sitting there long after we went to sleep." Evan didn't say anything at first. He just stared at me, and for the first time since we'd left, I saw it. The fear creeping into his expression. The same fear I had felt all night. We drove home in silence. I never took him camping again.